Hey friends, thanks for watching the opening remarks from day 2 of the Build Your Audience Online Summit. As you can see, I am not by myself, so let's make ourselves a little bit bigger here. I'm joined by my good friend Lee Matthew Jackson, who's one of the speakers of this event. Lee, thanks so much for taking the time for joining me today.
No problem. I mean, you put out a call for anyone who's hyper attractive to join you on a call, and here I am. Thank you.
You clearly qualify for that 100%. So, the reason Lee is here is because after I'm done with the opening remarks, I want to have a conversation with Lee about adjusting your brand and recognizing when it might be time to talk to a different audience. There are some warning signs that both he and I know all too well from our own experiences, and we want to share some insights on when we knew it was the time to pivot with our marketing. But first of all, let's do some housekeeping here, and let's go over day 2 on the Build Your Audience Summit. So first of all, as yesterday, big thank you to the sponsors, the Digital Navigator, Cloudways, Weglot, Virtual Summit Mastery, my own course, of course. Without those companies and the support that I've been receiving from the individuals behind the companies, namely Jim and Paul from Digital Navigator, Thomas from Weglot, and the lovely team around Always from Cloudways, this event wouldn't have been happening. So big shout out to those people. And what I want to make sure from the very get-go is that you are aware about the resources that we have for all these sessions, specifically the note-taking resources. So on this page, let me just open that in a new tab. You can download sheets to take notes either by hand or take notes digitally. And I really want to invite you to take advantage of this, because these note-taking sheets, they will help you get the most out of these sessions, because the sessions are available for 24 hours only, and then they get added to the All Access Pass vault. And in those 24 hours, you want to make the most out of the content that you can consume. So when you set aside the time to watch any of these amazing sessions, we have Elizabeth Pokorny on dominating multilingual SEO today. We have my special friend Lee Matthew Jackson, who's with me here, on podcasting, which is essentially, he's the reason I've started the Virtual Summit Mastery podcast. So you've played a big role in that, Lee. Our mutual friend Kim is with us today on day 2 of the summit, talking about content marketing that organically drives sales and builds your audience. We have Mr. Voice Marketing himself, Chip Edwards, also known as Santa Claus. When you look at that image right here. So Chip has grown quite a beard over the pandemic, but nevertheless, he knows his stuff.
It's the flash of red as well in the picture. It just does it for me.
It's so true. It's so true. And he's just amazing with voice marketing, especially with Google Home and Alexa skills. Oh, I've triggered mine right now, so I have to be careful about what I'm saying. Otherwise, the office is going dark in a minute. So if you want to have your content on those smart home devices, Chip's session is what you want to listen to. And then we have the founder of Livestream Universe, Ross Brand, which is massively experienced in live streaming. He's been doing that for like 10 years or something. It feels like before cameras were a thing, he was already live streaming. So definitely a session you want to pay attention to if you want to up your game with live streaming. And lastly, in roughly 3 hours from now, we have a live webinar with the Digital Navigator. And you'll see a difference over to yesterday. Yesterday, I had the YouTube embedded on this page directly, which caused some confusion for some attendees. So what we're doing today is we're inviting you to join us on either Facebook or YouTube directly, so that you have the best experience with engaging with us during the webinar, submitting your questions and stuff like that. That was a little bit tricky yesterday, but we're all learning as we go along. We're all making mistakes sometimes. We're all improving as we go. So for this webinar, to turn your website into a lead generation machine, Paul will give you exact steps, what you need to do in order to get more leads and sales from your website. And you can join it on Facebook and YouTube. And of course, the replay will be embedded here on this page. and in the Digital Navigator booth. And now, Lee, I would love to start that conversation that we were talking about earlier and talk about some of the warning signs that you've seen in your own brand before you pivoted.
Sure. And are we talking about pivoting the brand, as in changing the brand name, or are we talking about the actual business and the products? Because I've got multiple
the branding
examples.
And messaging to the audience and stuff like that.
Yeah, sure. Okay, because one of the at least two examples I can give you is the original WP Innovator podcast, if you'd like to.
Yep.
Okay, so
of course.
So there were signs there. So I had the WP Innovator podcast many years ago, and that has now been rebranded about 4 years ago now to the Agency Trailblazer podcast. The target audience was always agency owners, but it was agency owners who used WordPress because they were going to be my ideal client. So I called it the WP Innovator podcast. But before long, I started to realize that the audience I was attracting was predominantly agency owners who used a wide mix of technology. And I knew I could help them regardless of the tech they used. And it became a really valid sign that I was potentially holding myself back by remaining as the WP Innovator. So we switched it over to Agency Trailblazer, thankfully, quite early on. So we've now got a lot of brand equity over the last few years. That's one example, at least. And that was the warning signs.
Yeah. So essentially you were getting feedback from your listeners and from your podcast subscribers that maybe you should talk about other topics, or maybe the topics you were mentioning in the podcast episodes weren't too relevant?
It was mainly me actually seeing what my audience were doing. So I created a group, and it's really important to have some sort of way of interacting with the community that you have around you. So I was looking at the sorts of projects they were involved in. I was looking at their websites. I was seeing the sorts of questions they were asking in our community, etc., and started to recognize that WordPress was just a very small part of their overall problems. They weren't really interested in how do I do X, Y, and Z in WordPress. They were really interested in how do they run a successful agency? How do they make more money? How do they attract more leads? They were the way more important questions. So, we started to pivot away from, if you listen to the very first episode, it was all like clear WordPress tech. And nowadays, if you listen to our podcast, it is completely focused, on managing your business. And that was by watching and listening to what the community were already talking about and or already doing on their sites.
What was involved in that pivot? I mean, you had the podcast already, like what, 50, 60 episodes in.
Mm-hmm.
You had the podcast website, of course. You had all the marketing collaterals. How did you go about executing that pivot?
Really easy. I didn't think about it. I just went ahead and did it. So quite simply, I decided to rename. And I chose a name that I felt was more generic, Agency Trailblazer. We were WP Innovator, and we wanted to keep the innovation aspect of it. But Agency Innovator just doesn't quite have the right ring to it. And I think maybe there was something else out there at the time, which is why I probably didn't go in that direction. A trailblazer is just as much an innovator as anyone else. So it's that same sort of feeling of somebody who goes to places that maybe no one's gone before, or, at least traverses into difficult areas and succeeds, a trailblazer. So we went for that wording. We designed the brand. We built everything in the back end and didn't tell anyone about it at first, so that we had everything ready. We had the website ready. We'd already procured the domain and the multiple versions of the domain. We'd got the clone website ready. And then we launched with a Facebook Live and a podcast episode and an email campaign that explained why we were rebranding. And on the day we launched I Switched the website, we also told Google that we had changed the URL, and we also made sure we set up all the necessary redirects. This meant that our domain was going to be going over from wpinnovator.com to agencytrailblazer.com for a while, and our results in Google would still be the old domain. But that didn't really matter because people would still hit our site. And what we found was pretty much zero SEO hit for us when we'd finally transferred over. It took about a month for Google, etc., to update its URLs. And we've obviously maintained the old redirections because there are people who had linked to old episodes on the old platform, etc. I mean, funny story, I actually rebranded Angled Crown. So we had Angled Crown as an agency, which you'll be aware we've recently closed. And we were Lee Jackson Dev. And I recognized back then that Lee Jackson Dev made it very focused on me, when actually it was my team who were doing a whole load of delivery. And it also made me sound like a freelance guy on my own when we were actually a team who would look after other teams. So our branding at that point still didn't represent who we were, what we were, and it didn't give that feeling of safety and premium quality. We had cartoons, we had all sorts going on. So we rebranded to something more premium. And we'd already had to go through that exact process even before we rebranded the WP Innovator website. So we knew that it wasn't going to be too much of a big deal. Ask me now to rebrand Agency Trailblazer. It may be a bigger deal because loads of people have heard of it now. I mean, we had a few thousand followers back then. Now we have thousands. It might be a bigger deal, but back then it wasn't too much. It wasn't too much of a problem, and I was glad I did it.
that actually is a very important statement, and I would love to know a little bit about what types of worries and anxieties and fears did you have before the rebranding? Like people tend to overcomplicate stuff quite a bit, especially in these rebranding ventures. You maybe know that you have to rebrand because you're not attracting the right people, the right leads, the right customers, but still it is scary to do that and to actually change the brand. Like what did that conversation look like for you?
Sure. So it actually, believe it or not, it becomes scary not to once you evaluate some very specific information. There's a story I tell people over and over again about how in 2007, 2008, my agency back then was hit by a recession and we had to change everything that we do. And the main things we started to ask ourselves was, what are we really good at? What do we love working on? What are our strengths? Who do we work with? Who do we work for? What are their problems? What are we awesome at solving? All of these really important questions. And we actually ended up figuring out that we were amazing in the events industry. And we're still in the events industry now and running a really successful and profitable agency in that sector. It was important to ask ourselves those questions because the moment we understood why we were doing things, what our strengths were, who we were serving, the problems that we were solving for those people, the solutions we were providing, the dreams we were helping people achieve, that made the company name, the branding, the messaging, the where we show up and the how we show up absolutely freaking obvious. And because we'd realized that we weren't showing up in that, we were now more scared that we weren't projecting the right image, and we wanted to push for our rebrand. We did that back in the Elliott Young days. We've done that for Event Engine, and we've also done that when we've recognized that in both, Lee Jackson Dev and in WP Innovator. And that's the point. I have actually gone through multiple rebrands, and that is fine. You don't have to get it right first time. People think that they're going to be stuck with their logo and name for life. You're not. If you got it wrong first time, or if your company changes, change it. I've closed down the Angled Crown brand because it's no longer relevant. Agency Trailblazer is the brand that's kind of pulled in Angled Crown with it, because I now offer services that are fully digital, whereas Angled Crown used to be also a physical development agency. So that's been sucked into Agency Trailblazer. It makes sense now at this point to retire that brand and bring it in under the Agency Trailblazer banner. So again, it doesn't matter. Personally, I don't think, unless you're Coca-Cola, it matters. But because they tried to rebrand. Look, in the 80s, they did this Coke, this like new Coke rebrand with this terrible logo. Oh, it was awful.
But this is such a refreshing story, and I think it's something that many people need to hear, is that nothing is set in stone, especially in the digital space where we are all operating. It's like things change, humans change, people change. So it totally makes sense to rebrand from time to time to make the brand reflect who you really are. Before I let you go, I want to hear a little bit about what success you had with the podcast after rebranding. So how did that impact your business?
Well, it very quickly ended up with new customers for Angled Crown. So the whole purpose behind the podcast originally was to grow an audience of agencies that would need my WordPress services. Our WordPress services were things like support, plugin development, and theme development. And that's exactly what happened. WP Innovator attracted a few. Switching to Agency Trailblazer, it attracted some of the bigger agencies with the bigger budgets. So that was an not instant, but within a few weeks, we were starting to attract a completely different type of audience, thus completely different types of customers. Right now, as we've phased out the actual service, we're still selling digital products. We still have our event. We still have our sponsorship. So that has now replaced everything that we used to do with Angled Crown. So if you think of the trajectory, we went from WP Innovator attracting kind of mid-range agencies to switching to Agency Trailblazer, attracting some of those big agencies, running a successful business to the point /brand, to the point where we can actually put aside the old stuff and just become a digital product /event /sponsored company, because we've got some great partners, including Cloudways, who sponsor all of our content, which is phenomenal. So I guess the short answer is frickin' A, it's been amazing. Yeah.
I think that
I actually thought about that for a long time. I'm just like, wow, that is so cool. Because we were doing a lot of work. We were churning out a lot of themes for clients, even the bigger paying clients. And we had a big team. That team's all moved over to Event Engine now, which is great, because Event Engine is going from strength to strength, which is phenomenal. So they've taken quite a lot of the developers that were an Angled Crown. It's just been such an amazing journey, and I'm so glad that we did it. I was nervous at first, but once I'd done the same exercise I'd done all those years ago of, who is it I'm serving? It became more scary staying as I was than it did changing.
Yeah. That is just it makes total sense. And obviously, I know the story a little bit from being friends with you over the past few years, and we've spoken back and forth about this stuff. And one thing that I've learned from you in regards to podcasting is that, first of all, it can have huge impacts if you are consistent with it.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talked about the Virtual Summit Mastery podcast and how I could go about recording that, first of all, it took me like a year to wrap my mind around the entire concept and seeing me actually do the podcast, even though you've been bugging me for ages. But then also what is a big influence for me is that I'm giving myself 6 months executing the podcast every single week. I'm committing to a podcast episode every single week, and I'm not evaluating the results of the podcast before those 6 months have passed, because you need a little bit of time to build up that momentum with the podcast. You need a little bit of time to get better at podcasting. And obviously, even though you have the equipment and you are quite comfortable interviewing people and doing live streams and stuff like that, it doesn't mean that doing a podcast comes easy. And
when I looked at my results very early on, it was depressing, because it's new and it takes time.
But we have the Barmy Army.
Matt!
You rock, Matt. Awesome.
Check out Nurture Flow. Although, Matt, you need to do a few more episodes. Nurture Flow podcast. He's done some cracking episodes. He's done his first season, and there's a few really good episodes on there that are well worth a listen.
Yep, there are. And also check out funnelpacks.co.
Oh yeah, totally.
If you want to set up some funnels for lead generation and client generation.
And I think hunkygorgeousman.com as well. You'll see a picture of Matt.
I actually think that Matt is just a really clever AI.
Do you think? Well, he's like one of the best I don't know. It's on hiatus for a couple more weeks. That's fine, mate. Seasonal podcasts are really good because you keep people waiting. I'm looking forward to season 2. Yeah,
building the anticipation right there. That's another nice bonus lesson, actually. So Matt's enjoying the conversation clearly here. So thanks for spending time with us, Matt. I want to keep the opening remarks quite short. Watch Lee's episode if you want to start a podcast. And my podcast actually is ranking number 6 in Austria, I think, on Switzerland, from on Apple Podcasts in marketing. So that's
nice.
Not like a small category. I didn't do any like proper launch for the podcast. Seems that the ranking algorithm itself picked it up quite nicely.
Sweet.
without doing any proper launches. So again, check out the day 2 sessions for the summit. Let me just put up the URL real quick. buildyouraudiencesummit.com/day2. You've got 24 hours for all those amazing sessions about voice marketing, content creation, podcasting, live streaming, and obviously multilingual SEO. Lee, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, mate.
I think we'll close the opening remarks by now, and I'm looking forward to catching up with everybody in the comments below the